Let me start first by reminding you of something and everybody indeed remarks on it, that most Australians, with the shameful exception of the Aborigines, enjoy a standard of living in politics enjoy a politics that's so decent that most of the peoples of the earth now and in the past could only dream of. Yet we're discontented and disillusioned. It says in that quarterly essay I mentioned that we're angry, and she took her cue on that from Amanda Vanstown, whom she reports as saying, quote, "I've always thought that Australians had an inbuilt angry streak." Tingle may be right. She has her ear much closer to the ground than I do. I don't feel angry, though it's true I still wonder what on earth Tony Abbott and Julia Gillard think of us, that they could so persistently insult the political intelligence of the electorate. In his Boyer lectures some years ago, Martin Krieger said that in politics it's always important to ask compared to what. Tingle reports Mark Textor saying that relativities don't really matter to people in politics, that they find no consolation knowing that others are worse off. Well, sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. But you don't have to be naive or moralistic to be astonished by the fact that Australians are so disconsolate when they're doing so well economically and politically. Just imagine how many people on the face of the earth would just jump at a chance to emigrate here, and having done so would believe themselves to be in paradise. I don't mean that we should be thankful that our leaders don't murder us and torture us, that we should be glad that we won't be taken away at 3 o'clock in the morning and disappear. Nor do I mean that we should be glad that we're not starving, or that a significant part of the population are not ravaged with disease. We are indeed so remote from nations that suffer these things that it would be absurd for us seriously to compare our plight to theirs, or at any rate for it to enter into our everyday political consciousness. But it's not true of comparisons with Britain or America or, as you all know, parts of Europe. Many people in Britain now really are suffering seriously under a financial crisis and the measures that have been taken to ameliorate it. And their suffering is compounded by the contempt of their politicians, who are not ashamed to declare that the reason why the very rich should get a tax cut is because it might reduce their inclination to be tax cheats, or to be lectured to by a Minister of Education who can say to students who have been burdened with massive fee increases, I quote, "Some people might be put off applying to our elite institutions by the prospect of taking a debt of this size, which is, as far as I'm concerned, all to the good." You see. Well, political theorists and journalists like Laura Tingle are better placed than I am to explore some of the reasons for our discontent. But as a philosopher, I'm interested in the concepts that we use to describe our responses to the world. And this evening I'm concerned with some of the concepts that we would use to characterise that disillusion with politics. For many of us, it's an estrangement from politics, even if we're not angered by it. I'm ashamed to say that I sometimes barely read a newspaper all week, sometimes, well, on occasions. And I do, of course, read things online and watch TV news and so on, but if I'm honest, that's not to a degree that would compensate for what my education gave me reason to believe now is an unforgivable political irresponsibility on my part. The irresponsibility is not as an individual, Raimond Gaita, but as a citizen of Australia, and as such, of a nation that's part of a community of nations, rightfully concerned with the fate of the citizens of other nations in that community. Max Weber, one of the founders of sociology, called his classical essay about the distinctive nature of political responsibilities, its ties to and estrangements from morality. He called that essay Politics as a Vocation. He could have called it The Dignity of Politics. And many of us would say that the dignity of politics is an oxymoron, and I think people might say ditto for the morality of politics. True, they'd say it with a smile, but an awkward one, I think. We're not sure whether we believe that politics can have dignity, but doesn't now, and won't in the foreseeable future, or whether we believe that the very concept of dignity has at best only attenuated application to politics. We don't know whether we're disillusioned with our politicians while having a firm hold on the standards that would inform our disillusionment, or whether we're losing our grip on the concepts that make those standards what they are, that give the content to those standards. The importance of that distinction that I just made between people losing confidence in their beliefs and losing a grip on the concepts which give content to their beliefs is in fact hard to elaborate. But if we don't make it, we'll continue to misunderstand the nature of our discontent, I think, the nature of our estrangement from politics. Well, I've little to say this evening about the kind of disillusionment which is simply a function of the fact that we're no longer sure what we believe, not sure whether we still believe in our ideals, for example, or whether we should believe that we can trust our politicians. Disillusionment of that kind is a testimony to the standards, to the ideals that inform the disillusionment in much the same way as it's often been said, hypocrisy pays tribute to the virtue that it flouts. But unless that kind of disillusionment declines into a nihilistic cynicism and denies the existence of those values, it is, as I said, a testimony to them, even if in a backhanded sort of way. Well, we have plenty of reason to be disillusioned, but none for cynicism. Indeed, I'd say that though there are many causes of cynicism, there are never grounds for it. Nothing would ever justify it, even when it's humanly understandable. We never have grounds for saying, for example, that the concept of justice and injustice, or good and evil, answer to no reality, that they have no application to the terrible things that are done to millions of people all across the world, to our fellow beings, done to our fellow human beings, by our fellow human beings. And nothing could ever give us justification to mock or to regard with an ironic, urbane condescension Edmund Burke's remark that all that's necessary for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. When I was a student in the 60s, I was inspired, as were many people throughout the world, by a powerful speech by Martin Luther King, one of the leaders of the civil rights movement. He was assassinated in April of 1968, and the speech was called "I Have a Dream." And he reiterated those words, "I have a dream," almost like a chant, in cadences that made his speech hypnotic, with a promise of hope soon to be fulfilled. The dream was of a world in which justice prevailed, in which all human beings would regard one another as, quote, brothers and sisters, and in which the physical expressions and psychological scars of racism had disappeared. From the first time I heard it, my feelings about this speech, though I was inspired by it, were nonetheless mixed. But only recently did I quite realise why. Though I was moved by its undeniable power, I was resistant to the idea that a person's energies for justice should be ignited and sustained by a dream. How, I wondered, could the reality of justice, the often uncompromising authority of its demands, adequately be represented in an invitation to share a dream? When dreamers wake up, reality invariably disappoints them. And that's what most of my elders said at the time, as theirs had said to them, and now as people my age are saying again. Well, what troubled me then was the idea that a realistic acknowledgement of the claims of justice should depend on one's assessment on how things turned out, because nobody knows how things will turn out, on whether the pessimists or whether the optimists would prove right. And I thought at the time, and still do think, that one can be realistic about human nature and the moral possibilities of political action, and also believes that nothing matters more than to live justly. People may, of course, answer differently to the demands of justice. We all live different lives. But that one is answerable to them, I think, is not negotiable. Well, I'd be unjust to King's speech, I now realise, and distort even my initial response to its rhetorical power to think that it was tailor-made to cause disillusionment. I now think it expressed two conflicting conceptions of justice, and I want to elaborate just a little bit one of them. His speech inspired many people to generous, sometimes to dangerous action. People were killed during the civil rights struggle. But it also took them to something deeper. It offered them a perspective on justice from which they saw that it's not simply an instrument to achieve material and psychological goods, to avoid causing people natural psychological or physical harm. One aspect of the inspirational quality of his speech relied on the belief that the value of justice, what we prize and indeed cherish in it, can never really be accounted for, or never accounted for entirely, by the natural benefits that it brings us. And the terribleness of injustice, the kind of terribleness that it is, can never be entirely explained by the natural harms, physical or psychological, attendant on it. Victims of injustice suffer not merely certain forms of natural harm, physical or psychological damage, for example, but also the injustice of their affliction, which is a distinct and irreducible source of torment to them. Simone Weil expressed this beautifully when she wrote, I quote, "The just man must be thanked for being just, because justice is so beautiful a thing. Any other gratitude is servile and even animal. The only difference between the man who witnesses an act of justice and the man who receives a material advantage from it is that in such circumstances, the beauty of justice is only a spectacle for the first, while for the second, it's the object of contact and even a kind of nourishment." But to turn now to my primary concern this evening, which is to try to characterise the consequences of the fact that, as it seems to me, we have an increasingly fragile hold on the concepts in which the idea of political dignity finds its home. Or to put it another way, my concern might be expressed as being with the consequences of the fact that the words and the phrases that enable us to retain full possession of and use creatively that family of concepts in which a sense of the dignity of politics has its home, have an insecure place in our life with language. Some of those words are vocation rather than career, honour, character, the virtues, governing, insofar as we distinguish that from running the country. They're becoming as anachronistic to most of us as the concept of chastity. Well, the difficulty in distinguishing between an insecure hold on one's beliefs and an insecure hold on the concepts that give the content to those beliefs, the difficulty is there because the distinction is indeed an obscure one to some degree. And one primary reason it's obscure is that the concept of a concept, if I might put it that way, is far from clear. And philosophers disagree very deeply in their accounts of it. Well, obviously I can't even sketch what's most seriously at issue in those controversies. But I hope that by giving an example of a disagreement which is over the application of a concept, I can make my point sufficiently clear, at least for my purposes this evening. My example is the disagreement over whether gays and lesbians should be permitted to marry. And to avoid repeating the phrase gay and lesbian marriages, I'll refer only to gay marriages, taking this to refer to both, and I hope not offending anybody. Well, it's my impression that many people under 40 are incredulous that this could be an issue at all. And I think that they're right. And unless there are astonishing political and cultural or ethical reversals in the next few years, most countries, at least in the West, will permit gay marriages. We will then, I think, or sometime afterwards, be as incredulous that we thought this to be an issue which should be up for serious discussion, as now is the case if someone were to bring up racial intermarriage as a topic for debate. Julie Gillard has often mocked Tony Abbott for being on the wrong side of history. On this matter, she's going to join him. But be that as it may, this evening I'm not concerned really to argue that gays should be permitted to marry, but to characterise one aspect of the debate and its political consequences. People support and oppose gay marriage for different reasons. Much of the disagreement does not involve disagreement about the application of concepts. Some people believe that gay sex is immoral. Disagreement over that seldom hinges on the concept or on disagreement about the concept of immorality. Some people think that to allow gays to marry would undermine family life. And generally the same people believe it's far better for children to be brought up by heterosexual couples. Those are empirical claims about the facts answerable to evidence. But there's an objection to gay marriage which is of an altogether different kind. And we hear it when people say, marriage is, that emphatic is, between a man and a woman. And they might say this they might say, going on from that, that's what marriage means. By definition, they might be tempted to say, though of course they know there's no point in going to a dictionary to prove their point. They believe that it's of the very nature of marriage, that it belongs, one might say, to the very concept of marriage that is between a man and a woman. And that's what informs that emphatic is when they say marriage is between a man and a woman. For that reason, they believe that gays and lesbians can't have what they most deeply want, not because the law will always forbid it, but because the law can't make married love out of what is intrinsically unsuited to it. Even if the law were misguidedly to permit same-sex marriage, this thought continues, these would be marriages in inverted commas only. The state can't do what is conceptually impossible to do. Not even God actually can do what is conceptually impossible to do. And if we were to try to do so by permitting same-sex marriage, it would sow confusion and degrade the concept. Why do they believe this? Well, there are many reasons, but there's one upon which I want to comment tonight. And it goes roughly like this. Gay couples love each other as persons, and perhaps their love of one another is coloured by the fact that they have sex. But the love and the sex can't come together to deepen one another in the way required by marriage. To put it simply, but I don't think the thought comes in a much better version, they think that gay relations are relations of love plus sex, that the sex is not integral to the love. Its nature as love and its nature as sex are not interdependent. But marriage, they say, is essentially, I think they're right about this, essentially the celebration of a sexual union. Not only the unions of friends and companions who also give one another sexual pleasure, it is, this thought continues, the recognition of the way our sexual nature goes deep in our sense of what it means to be human, in a way that conceiving of it as only an instrument of pleasure could never be. This objection is not essentially moral, or perhaps more accurately, one fails to see what's most interesting about it if one thinks that it's essentially moral. People who object morally to anal sex don't think that anal sex is an oxymoron, or that it's an expression that should be put in inverted commas. But the people whose attitudes I've just characterised do believe that gay marriage is an oxymoron, that in places where it appears to exist, that is in certain countries where it appears to exist, it exists only in inverted commas, that in those places the law has fallen into incoherence. But, of course, what is here affirmed as conceptually impossible is exactly what gays and people who support their wish to be married affirm as possible and actual. What gays want, I am tempted to say, is the affirmation of the depth of their sexual being in the constitution of their sense of humanity. The denial of it, they feel, is to be a diminution of their humanity, rather than merely, if I might put it this way, a denial of their civil rights or other obligations owed to them as citizens and persons. To conceive the wrong done to gays when they're denied marriage as unjust discrimination is to conceive it in the wrong dimension, on the wrong plane, as it were. It can only touch the surface of the insult that is in fact being done to them. Well, I've used the political demand that gays be permitted to marry as an example of a disagreement that is about the application of a concept, in this case the concept of marriage. But it has further and more direct relevance to the title of my lecture, Political Dignity. Our sense of a common humanity is, I think, premised on our capacity to see in all human beings that their humanity is defined, just as ours is, by the possibility of ever-deepening responses to the meanings of the big facts of life that define the human condition: our mortality, our vulnerability to misfortune, and, of course, our sexuality. Blindness to that depth and its potentialities is partially blindness to their full humanity. And to have laws that are premised on blindness to the full humanity of our fellow citizens is to wrong them in a way much deeper that can be conveyed by the complaint that they're denied access to goods and opportunities. For that reason, even people who see no good in marriage at all, including gays who are hostile to it because they believe it distorts the potentialities of their sexuality, have reason to seek revision of the Marriage Act as a political imperative. Law, I believe, hopes for the consent of those who are governed by it. Most obviously, of course, in the case of criminal law, where we hope that those who are justly punished will see the justice of it and consent to it. But even where punishment is not an issue, the same is true, I think. Some laws are controversial in the sense that people of understanding and goodwill can disagree about them. And in such cases, it's reasonable to ask citizens to consent to the law, even when it causes them serious disadvantage. But if the law effectively denies your full humanity, you can't be expected to consent to it without servility, without degrading yourself. And such laws are therefore an affront not only to those who are the victims of them, but to all citizens whose identity as citizens is partially defined, but crucially defined, by their acceptance of the rule of law. Therefore, those laws are therefore an affront to the dignity of their political communality. In our times, that communality is mostly that of nation states, for it's usually states of which people are citizens. Laws to which no one could consent without servility and degradation undermine the dignity of the nations that enact them and compromise the common good of their citizens, at least if one thinks of the common good as partially defined by our ability to love clear-sightedly and without shame the nation to which one belongs. Well, the demise of concepts, or the realization that our grip on them is fragile, usually creeps up on one. This became dramatically evident to me in the case of the concept of the university in the early 1980s. Then, a number of philosophers in Britain, and I was amongst them, gathered at the University of Leeds to form an organisation that we hoped would protect the discipline. One philosophy department had already been closed. The Vice-Chancellor opened the meeting and he spoke movingly about why he and other academic administrators had, he thought, sometimes compromised the integrity of their institutions in often futile attempts to accommodate government pressure. To a junior minister of education who was present, the philosophers argued, he was also a minister who had done philosophy at Oxford. So anyway, to this junior minister of education who was present, the philosophers argued persistently that no institution that lacked a philosophy department could rightly call itself a university. A cultured man, he listened carefully, but eventually said impatiently, when this point was pressed on and on, well, in that case, we'll call it something else. We didn't know what to do. The concept had died on us. Or at least our confident grasp on it had slipped away. And indeed, going back to my discussion of gay marriage, what opponents of gay marriage fear would happen to the concept of marriage if gays were permitted to marry had indeed happened to the concept of university. It just went defunct. I often wondered whether that Minister of Education knew what he had done in revealing that a concept that had for hundreds of years enriched critical reflection about one distinctive form of the life of the mind, the academic form, had become defunct, that it no longer had the power to do it. By defunct, I mean it's just simply not the case that anybody in universities thinks about what goes on in them under the concept of a university. So if you say, for example, you can't have a university without a philosophy department or a classics department or this or that department, people really do think, in that case we'll call it something else. It doesn't really matter. You've got it in some other institution or whatever. I mean, that's just now a fact about the application of that concept. Whether we will lament it or rejoice in it is an entirely different matter. But I often wonder whether he knew what he'd done in perhaps exposing that concept as defunct, or whether he really did think, what's all this fuss about a name? We have all these institutions in the United Kingdom. We have to think now, here and now, in these political and these financial circumstances, what to do with them, what we want from them. Whether he simply thought that. Well, the English philosopher Michael Dummett asked not so long ago whether we would have ever thought that an institution without a philosophy department could justifiably call itself a university if philosophy had developed only recently. He might have asked the same question of most of the disciplines in a university, and the answer would have been the same. We would not have thought they were necessary to a serious understanding of what it is for an institution to be a university. The rhetorical point of Dummett's question is, of course, to suggest that the claim that an institution could not justifiably call itself a university unless it had a philosophy department disguised an historical accident about institutions as a conceptual truth. He might have gone on to say that it often goes with fantasies about a golden age in university life, and in that respect he wasn't very far from the junior Minister of Education in denying that it could ever be described as a conceptual truth, ever be described as essential to the nature of the concept of university, that substance. I think he was, Dummett's a great philosopher, and I have enormous respect for him, but he was badly mistaken. Because the best thought about the university was never about a Platonic form of it, nor was it about an historical paradigm. It was thought that was inward with a distinctive form of the life of the mind that universities nourished. Thought that was in dialogue with a history of reflection that went back at least to Socrates. It was that historical depth, rather than a metaphysical essence or an historical paradigm. It was that historical depth that ensured fertile reflection upon one historically accidental form of the life of the mind, the academic form. And that same quite contingent historical depth also secured for the concept, and this is now going to be very important to what I say later, that same historical depth secured for the concept some distance from times and places to make it possible for thinkers to judge whether they are right or wrong, doesn't matter. To judge that their desires, their purposes, their aspirations, even were true or false to the concept of the university, to that historically contingent concept. And that kind of thought is thought of a kind that can deepen without limit, can never be exhausted by a set of definitions. And, as I intimated a moment ago, can awaken new desires that we'd never had, responsive to values that we'd never before encountered. And the reply, therefore, to someone who asks, or rather the reply that once might have been given to someone who asks, what do we want from all these institutions that we call universities, would be to say, well, it depends on what you mean by university. Depends on what kind of reflection on the concept, what kind of content reflection on the concept of university will deliver to us. And that might change what it is that we want. Well, I've elaborated that example of the concept of the university at some length because what I wanted to say about its historical depth, the historical depth that that concept was able to deliver to people who thought about the idea, as Newman called it, of a university, applies to all thought that marks vocations. Reflection about what it is to be a teacher, a nurse, a craftsperson, and of course a politician, and perhaps even a citizen, can deepen without limit if it's under the concept of a vocation in a way that makes no sense. In a way that enables one to say that an entire age has lost the idea, the concept of what it is to be a politician, honouring the responsibilities of a vocation, for example. But it makes no sense, I think, to say that when one's speaking of a career or a profession, to say the entire age has lost an idea, an understanding of what it means for something to be a career. And I think it has only attenuated sense in relation to the concept of a profession. And I suspect that what sense it has depends on the fact that most professions are also, or used to be, thought of as vocations. But of course now nobody speaks that way. The concept of a vocation, the word vocation now just means essentially for us a job, that it's a job. And when politicians think about what they do under the concept of a career, it may be that they've lost the concept of a vocation. It may be because of that they think so persistently in the present and so very, not at all very distantly into the future. The concept of vocation, I'm suggesting, the concept of politics as vocation, the title of Weber's essay, because of the historical depth that concepts of vocation had and reflection on it had, enabled, as I said, people to distance themselves to some degree from time and place. The concept of a career doesn't do that. Well, if what I've said is more or less right, or even more or less right, then I think we can see that what's at risk here is a robust concept of democratic citizenship and its distinctive responsibilities and joys. I hadn't heard of the survey that Caroline mentioned at the beginning of how many young people apparently are untrusting of the idea of democratic citizenship. But anyway, I'm trying to give an account of why some of that might be dismaying, though it is. Well, the joy that citizenship can inspire was evident to us, all of us, who saw in the faces of people in former dictatorships how they responded to being given a vote for the first time in their lives. They queued for hours and hours sometimes in the hot sun. And to be sure, that joy was the joy of freedom, but it was freedom of a citizen in a democratic polity. Citizens who prize the dignity of such citizenship, the dignity that such citizenship confers on all human beings who are fortunate enough to have the gift of it. I'll give two of many possible examples to illustrate my point. In the early 1990s, when the Victorian government proposed to place some of its prisons in private ownership, the debate was primarily over whether such prisons would be efficiently managed. That was one of the early expressions of the idea, which is now ubiquitous, that politics is basically running, managing institutions to serve our interests. But its application of prison should have raised a red flag on which was written the question, is it consistent with any serious conception of citizenship to hand one's fellow citizens over to private, profit-making organisations for their punishment? I don't say the answer is obvious, but we should have felt the pressure of the question, and we didn't. I come now to a second example. After the intervention in the Northern Territory in 2007, many people lamented that the Race Discrimination Act was cast aside so easily yet again. I think it was racist indifference on the part of enough Australians that enabled the government then to act against the Aborigines without consulting most of their leaders, and in a spirit that implied that their plight could be compared to a natural disaster. Hurricane Katrina was the example used, and that a quasi-military response was appropriate. But the government did that, was able to do it, only because it justifiably assumed that we have a fragile grasp on the fact that Aborigines are also our fellow citizens. The racism was an offence against the dignity of their humanity. The failure fully to recognise their citizenship was an offence against the dignity of their political status in the nation. Of course, the government denied that it acted racistly, but as I argued at the time and in a book entitled A Coercive Reconciliation, no plausible description of the plight of the Aboriginal communities could justify the condescension shown to them and to their leaders by the lack of consultation and the reckless disregard for the consequences of such dramatic and ill-prepared intervention. Even to describe the intervention as draconian, as people did, doesn't capture the nature of that condescension, because it doesn't distinguish between tough laws imposed after due consultation and tough laws imposed without it. Could such disrespect be shown to any other community in this country? The answer, I believe, has to be no. And if that's true, then it betrays neither cynicism nor a left-leaning political trendiness to suspect that, to a significant extent, many Australians still feel a form of racist denigration towards Aborigines. From that perspective of a racist condescension, the sincere concern for the children is concern for them as children of a denigrated people, just as it was when children, whom we now call the stolen generations, were taken from their parents. Noel Pearson's passionate support for the urgent purpose of the intervention enabled people to hide from themselves the contempt the intervention showed to the community on whose behalf it was undertaken. And if that's so, I'd say of the laws governing the intervention, even now, what I said about the laws that deny gays the possibility of becoming married. No one whom they govern can fully consent to them without servility. They are therefore an affront to the dignity of those to whom they apply, an offence against their human dignity and also their dignity as citizens, and they're also an offence to the political community, the polity that has enacted them. Well, you might, understandably, I acknowledge, think that I'm arguing that we need to inject a dose of morality into politics in order to restore its dignity, but that's not so. The relations between law, morality and politics are, I believe, complicated, and of course any account of them will be controversial. We're answerable in law not just for the harms that we do to one another, but also for the wrongs we do each other when we cause that harm. We're not answerable to one another under law just as human beings to one another, but as fellow citizens. Indeed, that we're answerable not only for the harms we cause one another when we wrong one another, but also for the wrongs we do one another is part of what it means to be a citizen. A wrongdoer whose acts falls under the criminal law acts in the first instance as against a fellow human being. And that she does so is fundamental to an account of why what she's done is a moral wrong. Our sense of what it means to wrong someone, in addition to harming them, our sense of the distinctive terribleness of wronging somebody, informs our sense of other human beings as our fellow human beings. But the fact that the wrongdoer wrongs a fellow citizen is fundamental to the description of the deed as a crime. If the victim forgives the person who wronged her, then she gives that person as a fellow human being rather than as a fellow citizen. She forgives a wrong, not a crime. The law responds to the action as a crime. It can't forgive the perpetrator of the crime, but it can pardon her. And though no one has the right to demand that the victim should forgive, citizens can demand that the law pardon a criminal. The criminal offends against his victim twice over, so to speak. Once as a fellow human being, and the second time, not a second time, but also as a fellow citizen. And because he acts against her as a fellow citizen, he offends the community of citizens whose law he has broken. For that reason, I want to say, though the concept of crime has an inexpugnable moral dimension, it's not exhausted by that dimension. Now, morality and politics. At least since the time of Socrates, Western political thought has been haunted by the belief, or perhaps more accurately by the fear, that morality and politics may be in deep and irreconcilable conflict. Not because politics is so disreputable that a morally good person could not take part in it, but because at critical points, moral and political conduct belong to incommensurable realms of value, both of which will claim the allegiance of any serious person. That does not mean, of course, that morality and politics are not in deep ways answerable to one another. Morality can't ignore the claims of politics, or politics those of morality. But indeed, for almost everybody who has taken the conflict seriously, the mutual answerability of politics and morality to one another generates tragic conflict. And just as politics may at critical junctures conflict with morality, so it may conflict with law, and often in the same circumstances and for the same reasons. This became apparent, to anybody for whom it needed to become apparent, in the debate in the West after September 11th over torture. Many people at that time came to believe that though torture might sometimes be morally justified, indeed morally obligatory, as the lesser of two evils, those same people believed that the law should remain, often believed, not always, but often believed, that the law should remain as it is, placing an exceptionless prohibition on torture. Some of the same people believed, however, that sometimes politicians must torture, or must permit torture, not themselves, but permit others to do it, although not in law. Not, however, for the reasons that morality might sometimes permit torture, but under an imperative distinctive to the responsibility of a political vocation, different from a moral imperative. Well, clearly this is a topic for a separate lecture, and I've sketched it as little as I have, only to indicate to you why you shouldn't assume that I've been arguing that the reason we've lost sight of dignity in politics is because there's so little morality in our politics. In fact, I think we're as ill at ease with the concept of morality as we are with many of the other concepts that I've mentioned. Of course, that does not help us when we think, or it doesn't help us to think clearly about the relations between law, morality, and politics. And that, I think, is partly the price we've paid for years of relatively frivolous scepticism amongst the intelligentsia about morality. The reason I call it frivolous is because nobody really lives their lives as though the moral scepticism has a serious place in it, as though the concept of something being morally terrible is an empty concept, one that applies to nothing. Still, You can't for years profess skepticism and relativism and for years celebrate transgression without paying a conceptual price for it. Earlier I said that we're becoming estranged from the family of concepts in which the sense of dignity of politics has its home, and you'll recall that on that list were vocation rather than career, honour, character, its virtues, governing, insofar as that was distinct from the idea of running a country. And I said that it's hard to elaborate the distinction, in part because the concept of a concept is so relatively unclear. And I said at the time that there's much philosophical controversy about it. Part of that controversy centres on the connection between language and concepts. And to a considerable degree, despite that controversy, there's agreement about the fact that we're limited in what we can think by what we're able to say. Which is why I lamented, and some of you may have recalled last year, the foolishness of academic administrators, for example, who believe that they can confidently keep an ironic distance from managerial newspeak and retain an understanding of the deepest possibilities of university education. And we all know that something like this is true in our response to racist or sexist language. Our worry about such language is not just that it's offensive to its victims, nor even that it expresses or betrays the attitude of the person who uses it. Our worry is that while we speak like this relatively routinely, that's how we'll think and won't be able to think differently. The problem, though, in politics is not so much the words we use as the words we don't use, or the words we use that undermines the possibility of reclaiming the ones we don't. Take honour as an example. One hardly ever hears the word in political context. I may be wrong, but I think the last time I heard a minister use it when he was called upon to resign was when Lord Carrington resigned in Britain, because it was revealed that inadequate intelligence was in partly the reason why the British were caught off balance when the Argentinians invaded the Falklands. No one, in fact, suggested that Carrington himself was at fault, but the failure was on his watch while he was Minister of Defence, and so he resigned, as he said, because honour required it of him, honour required by his office. And everybody accepted that as more or less part of the course, because it was part of their understanding of the nature of political office, that one might do such a thing. Had they then been asked why they thought that, why they thought it was part of the course, I'm sure the phrase, the dignity of politics, would not have been far from their lips. Well, it's hard to think of such ways of speaking sitting easily with talk of career politicians. And that phrase, career politician, still has, I accept, pejorative connotations for us, so the point I'm making, I suppose, is easily made. But if one thinks, or if one speaks of politics as a career, then it's natural to think that people will take it up as a career, to think of what they're doing under the concept of career. And the reason the phrase still has opportunistic connotations to us is, I think, because we know that certain values have gone with it, have disappeared with us. For a little while the concept of honour still had some life in politics, it was regarded as shameless to brazen out demands that one should resign because one had been manifestly incompetent or dodgy, and then compounding the offence by the provocative remark or claim, what, do you expect me to resign? You think I'm a shirker? I've got a job to do. But now I think we no longer think that kind of thing to be so shameless. We just expect it to happen. And the people who do it, I suspect, think nothing of it. They may even believe what they're saying. Of course we know what the word honour means. We don't have to go into a dictionary to find out. And if we were to ask how the concept functioned in, say, honour cultures, where, for example, people might kill their children because they've dishonoured their family, or how it might function in the mafia, for example, we can tell a reasonable story. But that doesn't enable us to feel at home with us in our use of it in contemporary politics. And the same, I think, is true for other concepts I mentioned earlier. Character, for example, as distinct from the concepts that mark celebrity or a glittering personality. We do still, to be sure, have an idea of a great character, or simply the idea we express when we say, what a character, as marking a mode of individuality which we think to be different from a glittering personality. And when I grew up, indeed, in central Victoria, people admired character even when they had little of it themselves, which actually was rare, and they were suspicious of personality because they think that's what film stars have. Well, I've often referred to our life with language of how our way to speaking can go dead on us. And I think it's important to my point to say that even if the value we hanker for is of the highest kind, even if we think that finding a place for it in our lives, political and personal, would immeasurably deepen them, we may nonetheless not be able to find a place for it in our living speech. And why that's so is indeed one of the deepest problems in the epistemology of value. But it is so, and it marks one of the differences between judgments of value and our ordinary paradigms of true and false beliefs, according to which a truth acknowledged is a truth possessed. But an appreciation of the grammar or even the beauty of a dead form of speech can't make that speech living for us. Our task, therefore, is to see how much of the language that would reveal to us the dignity of politics, understood as a vocation, is honestly and lucidly accessible to us in living and authoritative speech. It's tempting to represent that as a task to discover what we really at bottom believe, or what we can honestly and consistently believe after we've examined all our other beliefs. But discovering whether we can strike a non-rhetorical note in our talk about these things is not a matter of discovering whether we really believe that, for example, the concept of honour has a serious application in political life, or that we really believe that there are vocations. It's more like finding which of admired ways of living are real options for us, without sentimentality or some other form of inauthenticity. Laura Tingle says that Australians are angry partly because we no longer know what role government should play in the economy and labour relations, and therefore what we're entitled to in those spheres. She reports Mark Textor saying that leadership and vision are not the same issue, are not at issue, that Australians are used to treading water and they'll endure it as long as they can see the horizon, and someone points to it. But if we're at sea, treading water, then it's because arguments over what governments should do are no longer anchored to a place where we can speak the language of citizenship with confident pleasure. Only at that place are we able to discuss, without the soul-destroying rancour that now disfigures contemporary political debate, what politicians owe their citizens and citizens owe their politicians. Only there can we seriously think about what we're entitled to, or even know what to hope for when we look at the horizon. The desire for leadership is, of course, understandable. What values are, what they can mean, is revealed to us only in the way they make sense in authoritatively lived human life, and in the reflective appreciation of how they deepen a life, the life of the people who live those values. They're not accessible to us or attainable to us independently of such kinds of exemplars. If you want to know what justice is, you should look to the just man, said Aristotle. But of course, you have to have eyes to see. Or to change the metaphor for a better one, more consistent with the emphasis I've placed on the connection between what we can think and what we can say, exemplars will inspire us only if they speak to us in a language that lives for us. And of course, only if the language is alive to them will they have anything to say. For that reason, leaders, no matter how charismatic and visionary, cannot reclaim by themselves the common understanding in whose light they, together with us, can restore a language that will reveal the dignity of politics.